Hello and welcome everyone to PW OnlyIAS English channel. So the wait for you guys is finally over. We are here with the first lecture of UPSC Udaan series for Prelims 2025. Here in this class, we are going to talk about Indian polity. This is the first session on Indian polity and the topic of the session is going to be historical context of Indian Constitution. As many of you must be knowing that even though this topic is very static in nature, nonetheless every year we see one or two questions getting repeated in UPSC or various state public service commission exams. Not only for prelims but also for mains, we have seen questions around Government of India Act 1935, centralizing tendencies, etc. So I, Jatin Verma, am going to take these lectures in a manner that you gain the factual clarity, the command over the static portion, as well as the conceptual clarity. Before we begin with the lecture, there's a bit of small information for you guys. The PDF of these lectures will be uploaded on the Telegram channel Jatin Verma PW OnlyIAS. This is the QR code. You can scan the QR code to subscribe to the channel. Regular updates would be provided. And today we are a bit late. Tomorrow onwards we will be uploading the lectures at around 6 p.m. every day, right? So that you can get hold of it. Lectures are going to be full of conceptual plus factual content. So stay tuned for these. Now let's begin with the agenda for the class today. As you can see, 1600, arrival of the Britishers on the scene in the form of East India Company. Then 1765, the rights were given, the Diwani rights were given to the East India Company by Shah Alam. We are going to study these things in quite a detail so that you memorize the finer details for your exam purpose. Now, 1773 to 1853, this phase is called as first phase in this lecture of ours, as this phase signifies the rule by the company. That is, the company was having the rights and Britishers were through arm's length managing the affairs of the company. That means whatever mischiefs of company were there, the British rule were there, they were put on the heads of the company. So that Queen Elizabeth, the British Parliament, remains aloof or remains at the arm's length from whatever is happening in India. But after 1857, 1858, the Act of 1858 was passed after the revolt of 1857. Then the government of India, the British Parliament, took control over the government of India, right? So we are going to continue with these things so that you get a command on all these acts. Regulating Act of 1773, Act of Settlement 1781, Pitt's India Act 1784. What administrative changes did it bring about? Indian Councils Act 1892, Indian Councils Act 1858, then 1861, then 1892, then 1901, then 1919, then 1935, and finally Indian Independence Act of 1947. All these things we are going to cover. There are flowcharts and mind maps to help you memorize things. Now see here, these are the acts again. Pitt's India Act, Regulating Act 1773, Pitt's India Act 1784, Charter Act of 1813, Charter Act of 1833, then 1853, then 1858. Likewise, Indian Councils Act of 1861. Here onwards, the phase 2 starts, that is the rule by crown. Okay, phase 2, rule by crown. When the British Parliament directly took over the control of Indian administration in its hands, gradually centralizing the control and appointing the secretary to the state of India, then viceroy, placing viceroy under him. Likewise, these changes were brought about. Now, let's get started. The East India Company, which came to India in 1600, managed to capture substantial administrative power in 1765 in the aftermath of Battle of Buxar. These were the mistakes of Indian kingdoms of that time, Battle of Buxar, Battle of Plassey. But Battle of Buxar is considered to be the landmark. It enabled the Britishers in 1765 to get hold of the administration in India. Now, when the British got revenue and civil justice rights for Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. So BBO, you can memorize BBO 1765 onwards. Now, what was the reason that gradually they were able to penetrate the nook and corner of India? British company, East India Company was able to enter every nook and corner, all sorts of villages. The reason is their administrative system. The attention to the minor details that they had given in creating the institution of district collector, then allowing Christian missionaries. We are going to see those details as we proceed along in this lecture. Now, the trading company since then consolidated its power in such a way that they were able to expand their fins, expand their jurisdiction all over the India, nook and corner, remote corners of interior lands of our country. This reach and consolidation of administrative power was in the past seen in the dynasties of ancient and medieval empires such as Mauryas, Guptas and Mughal Empire. A bit of introduction to it. Getting into the finer details. Now see here, phase 1, the company rule 1773 to 1858. These are the acts. Quickly we can revise them. This is the second time we are seeing them. Division into phases is very important for you to comprehend, for you to understand, because when we would switch gear from this point onwards, you would see that the centralizing tendency gradually goes upwards from 1857 onwards, or after the act of 1858 was brought about, for obvious reasons that after having faced the revolt of 1857, the Britishers did not want to take any kind of chance, even though they pretended that by taking over the control from the company, the British Parliament is trying to be, Queen Elizabeth is trying to be benevolent, is trying to be soft, is trying to be kind-hearted towards India. But reality was the opposite. So, the rule is divided in the following phases: Crown Rule 1858, 1947, Government of India Act 1858, then two acts of 1861 and 1892. Then finally, Government of India Act of 1909, it is missing here. Then Government of India Act of 1919, then 1935. Morley Minto reforms, Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, 1919. Then finally, after that there was Simon Report, and ultimately came Government of India Act 1935. Okay, Indian Independence Act 1947. So let's get started. Phase 2, okay, this is there. We have repeated this. Now coming to the first act, Regulating Act of 1773. It designated the Governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal. A lot of detail, a lot of power comes with the change in the title. We will see, because it created an executive council. If you see here in the flow chart, we have incorporated some flow charts also. Now here, executive council, this executive council you are not supposed to confuse with the legislative council, because this executive council created under the Regulating Act of 1773 did not give any legislative powers. It basically gave the control in the hands of governor, who the first governor was, Governor General was Warren Hastings, right? So an executive council of 4 members was placed under him. All these 4 members were Britishers only, no association of Indians. Okay, it made the governor of Madras and Mumbai subservient to the governor. I had incorporated a diagram also. Okay, anyways, you can quickly draw this in this manner. Governor General of Bengal had the authority over governors of Madras and Mumbai as well. Okay, so these governors of Madras and Mumbai were placed under the Governor General of Bengal. They were subordinate to the Governor General. So, centralizing tendency, what was the element in the, if UPSC asks this question, what was the centralizing element in the Regulating Act of 1773? So, this is the centralizing element that you can see here, right? Now, it started from this act. Presidency, Warren Hastings served as the first governor of the presidency of Fort Williams, the head of the Supreme Council of Bengal, and the first Governor General of Bengal from 1772 to 1785, right? He served till 1785 for 12-13 long years. Now, Supreme Court was established at Calcutta. As you can see the building, it was set up in the year 1774. 1 Chief Justice and 3 other judges. So, 1 Chief Justice and 3 other judges. You can say 1, 2 and 3 other judges. Supreme Court was set up at Calcutta. Now, this was a mistake that they did not clarify the authority of the Supreme Court, which they did later on by passing an amending act. Whatever vacuum, whatever details were missing in the Regulating Act of 1773, those details were rectified or added through the medium of another amending act that we are going to see in a short while, barring the servants of the company from engaging in private trade. So the elements of corruption in administration amongst some of the IAS officers that we see even today, those elements were present even during the British Raj. Why? You can see the company officials were engaging in private trade of indigo, etc., the commodities. They will buy it at a cheaper price and they will sell it at a higher price to the company itself. So to curtail these activities of private trading by the agents of the company and accepting bribes, some nuances, some details were incorporated in the regulating act in terms of punishment for them, etc. Court of directors of East India Company were required to report on the revenue, civil and military affairs in India. As I told you, the control was always in the hands of the Britishers, barring of first few years. Okay, 1773 onwards, the control was there in the hands of the British Parliament because they were reporting. But the Queen, the Kingdom of Britain, always acted as if it had no control behind this mischief that was done to India. Right? So military affairs were also being reported to East India Company. Whatever military activities it had in India, all those were supposed to be reported to back to the Britain. Right? Now, laid the foundations of central administration in India. The credit goes to Regulating Act of 1773 for laying the foundations of central administration in India, regulating East India Company. 1773 Act did all these good things. Introduced central administration. Point 1 and 2 are related. It introduced central administration. Yes. How? Because the governors of Madras and Bombay were placed under Governor General of Bengal. Centralization. Supreme Court was set up at Calcutta, Fort Williams, right? Now, fourth one, first time the British were given the right to control over Indian affairs. Britishers were given the right for the first time. That is why we are starting from 1773. Governor General of Bengal was named as such. Earlier, he was known as Governor of Bengal. Why Governor General? Because he would have the superseding authority over governors of Bombay and Madras. They would be subordinate to him. First Governor General was Warren Hastings, 1772 to 1785. Administration by Governor General and Council. This was Executive Council. What do we mean by Executive Council? This will help only in the executive affairs of the government, no legislation, etc. Then Supreme Court to be established in Bengal, 1 CJI and 3 other judges. Prohibition to the servants of East India. These were the major main features of your Regulating Act of 1773. Now moving further, importance of this act. First step taken by the Britishers, British government to control and regulate the affairs of East India Company. Right? Now recognized for the first time the political and administrative functions of the company. So company was having three types of functions. Commercial functions were already there, but to manage the commercial functions, it was delineated that it will have to carry out certain political and administrative functions also. Otherwise, it will become difficult for the company to carry out commercial functions. What is happening through this act? Regulating Act passed in the British Parliament is giving the right to the Governor General of Bengal to manage the affairs of the company. In a way, Parliament of Britain is legitimizing whatever company is doing in the India. Got it? Laid the foundation of central administration. Now, amending Act of 1785, the purpose of this act was to rectify the mistakes. The purpose of this act was to rectify the mistakes committed by the Regulating Act of 1773. There were some gaps that were left unattended by the Act of 1773. It is known as Declaratory Act. Some declarations were made. The act was primarily passed to rectify the defects associated with the Regulating Act. Important features: jurisdiction of the Supreme Court established that Calcutta was confined to Calcutta only, that it won't have jurisdiction over Bombay and Madras presidencies. Okay, civil servants working. Now, this act, what happened, even to this day, the dilemma is still there. Okay, servants, civil servants accused in, for example, coal scam in India, 2012-13, right? They, if they are working in a bona fide manner, in a legitimate manner, they would not be punished. This dilemma is still there, that officials working in their purely official capacity, the IAS officers of independent India, they would also be protected. What happened in Regulating Act of 1773, by completely, in a way, constricting the IAS, the officers, civil servants of the company, they became so scared that they would stop acting in the official interest. Many of them wanted to leave India for the fear that they would be accused of corruption, etc. That is why the 1773 Act's mistake was rectified by amending Act of 1781, that anything done by the civil servants working in their official capacity, revenue collectors, judicial officers, that would not be frowned upon. That would not be looked upon as a corrupt activity. So that these officers, the honest ones, are rest assured that the government does not, the company is not going to prosecute them. Okay. Appeals from the provincial courts were to be taken to the Governor General in Council. So Governor General plus the 4 members, whatever appeals will come will not go to the Supreme Court at Calcutta. They would be heard by Governor General with the 4-member council. That is why this act clarified that the power of the Supreme Court would be restricted to just Calcutta. Cases from other provinces would be heard by Governor General in Council. Under the Regulating Act, the Governor General in Council was empowered to issue rules, ordinances and regulations, but they were to be registered in the Supreme Court. So, separation of legislature, legislative activity, rules. Law would be made by the British Parliament, but the rules within the law, act passed by the British Parliament, in Britain, whatever rules are required at the ground level in India, those could be framed by Governor General. But these rules, since Governor General is an executive organ, these rules are to be placed before judiciary. So separation of judiciary from executive found mention in this Act of 1781. Okay, you can see here ordinances and regulations can be made by the Governor General in Council, but those have to be registered with the Supreme Court for their legal validity. Got it? Now, Pitt's India Act, another major legislation. See, 1773 Act, this act is an addendum to the Act of 1773. It's just an adjuncture. It's not something out of the box, right? Now, it distinguished, Pitt's India Act of 1784 distinguished between the political and commercial functions of the company. 1773 distinguished between political, it gave the political and administrative powers, but a clear demarcation between the political and commercial activities came through the Pitt's India Act of 1784. Double government created a new board of directors to manage the political affairs, while commercial affairs were managed by the court of directors. Okay, now see here, Pitt's India Act, political functions will be managed by board of directors. Commercial functions of the East India Company, control still remains in the hands of East India Company only, right? Only the demarcation of political and commercial functions. Board of directors, now these board of directors will be having civil and military power. The commercial functions were vested in the court of directors. Commercial functions of the East India Company will be there, so that there is no mixing of commercial and the political and administrative functions. Am I clear? So this thing is there. Now, Charter Act of 1813. Charter Act of 1813, the Napoleonic Wars and the miseries that it caused prompted the traders to pressurize the government to end the monopoly. Because of wars by the Napoleon, the traders were looking outside their domain to trade in India. But because of the Regulating Act of 1773, British East India Company was given the monopoly by the British Parliament to only license that was given was only to the British East India Company. But Now, the traders who were victimized, the traders who were facing losses because of Napoleonic wars, they wanted to trade in India. It is here that the charter, why charter? Charter of trade, you can say. The charter was sought by these traders. Were they given? Were they given this charter is the moot question. We will see. Okay. Now, features of the Act of 1813, Charter Act of 1813. Company's rule was extended by another 20 years. So, because company was keeping them very happy, so the company's rule was extended by another 20 years. But the government introduced a strict licensing system. The government introduced a very, very strict licensing system. British merchants were allowed to trade in India under a strict licensing system under the Charter Act of 1813. However, for trade with China and the tea and opium trade, the company still retained its monopoly. Okay, licensing system was brought about even though the rule by company was extended, but others were also given the license. British merchants were allowed to trade in India under strict licensing system. That means other traders were also given a not completely free hand, but given an entry into India. But the trade with China and tea and opium trade, company had monopoly over. Company had monopoly over trade with China and opium and tea trade. Okay. Now, this act provided for a financial grant towards the revival of Indian literature. Whenever they introduced something extortionary to loot Indians, they tried to act benevolent. That now they would give 1 lakh rupees for education of Indians. Okay. Then they are saying that Indian literature would be revived. This is just like giving peanuts, appeasement of Indians. But in return, what are they doing? They have given license, they renewed the company rule, extended the company rule by 20 years and gave licenses to other merchants so as to trade in India. They would buy Indian goods, Indian primary produce, agricultural produce and sell it to the rest of the world or colonies after processing it or whatever, right? Now see here, these draconian measures are being brought about, but these benevolent measures are also accompanying. Easy to memorize? 1813, right? Now, Governor General of Bengal as Governor General of India. The major change brought about by this act was Governor General of Bengal was no longer the Governor General of Bengal alone. He would be declared as the Governor General of India. It made the Governor General of Bengal as Governor General of India. All civil and military powers were vested in him. All the civil and military powers were given to him. Earlier, what was the way? See, Pitt's India Act, Board of Directors, political functions, and then commercial functions. But the Act of 1813, what is it doing? All civil and military powers are given. Are we talking about commercial here? Not yet. Okay, we are not talking about the commercial yet. Lord William Bentinck was the first Governor General of India. It deprived the Governor of Bombay and Madras to make laws. All the law making power would now be investing in the Governor General of India, the first one being Lord Bentinck. Okay, ended the commercial activities of East India Company completely ended and took over the activities in its own hands. Who took over the control? British Parliament through Governor General of India. Now, the monopoly that was sought to be ended was brought about by Charter Act of 1833. Charter Act of 1833 appointed the Governor General of Bengal as Governor General of India. Governor General of India. Clear? Now it ended the monopoly. Did which act amended the monopoly? 1813 or 1833? It is 1833 Act, right? 1773. Let me give you a quick revision. 1773, 1781. Then we are coming to 1813 and then finally 1833, which ended the monopoly. In 1813 itself, the merchants who were facing losses because of the Napoleonic wars were wanting to end the monopoly. Monopoly was ended, but complete abolishment of the control, the rule by British East India Company was brought about by 1833. Emphasis added. Okay. Now, the law made under the previous acts were called regulations. That is why we see regulating act. Okay. But this passage, since the passage of this act, it came to be known as acts. Act word was precisely used, mainly used from this point onwards. Okay, earlier they said that we are regulating the activities of the company. Now with the Charter Act of 1813, the activities of company were brought to an end. That is why it would be appropriate to use the word act from this point onwards. And the control was completely given to one Governor General, Governor General of India. No longer he would be called as Governor General of Bengal alone. Okay, an Indian Law Commission was appointed under the provisions of the Act. Lord Macaulay was the first chairman of the commission. Let me just have a look here. Okay, the Act provided for the presidency of Bengal to be divided into presidency of Agra and the presidency of Fort Williams. Presidency of Bengal would be divided into two parts, Agra and Fort Williams. However, this never came into effect, even though it had a provision, but the provision was lying dormant. It was never implemented. Because why to break an entity? Why to break a state, a province which is working fine? It will unnecessarily invite unnecessary problem. So that's why the British Parliament abolished slavery in Britain and all its possessions in 1833. Slavery was abolished by the British Parliament, at least theoretically. Which Act? 1833. As I said, first extract, extort, and then act benevolent. Again, they are talking about good things, that we are abolishing slavery. Slave trade would not happen in the British possessions all over the world, wherever they had colonies in Africa, etc. Did this actually happen? No. Right? First, they will extort, try to, deepen their control on India, and then at last you would find some benevolent good things. In the last act, we saw 1 lakh rupees aid would be given, or grants would be given to promote Indian literature. What use is it of? Right? Now, Charter Act of 1833, Governor General of Bengal as Governor General of India attempted to introduce a system of open competition for entry into civil services, as the demand was raging for Indians to be given a place in the Governor General's Council. So they thought, okay, let's give open competition in the administrative services. Okay, this was opposed by the Court of Directors of the company. The laws made under the previous acts were called regulation. However, since the passage of this act, it came to be known as acts. Repetition out there. Indian Law Commission, etc. abolished slavery. This thing is taken care of. Now, what were the salient features? British government should take some steps for improving the conditions of slaves in India. Number one. Number two, administration was centralized. Right? Number three, Governor General of Bengal to Governor General of India. Then trade monopoly of East India Company on trade with China and trade in opium was ended. Okay, then this is number 4. Number 5, Governor of Bombay and Madras deprived of their power of making laws. They can now only suggest to Governor General. Governors of Bombay and Madras, because this act was highly centralizing in nature, what happened? It abolished the law making powers, the regulation making powers of Governor Generals of Bengal, Bombay and Madras, and gave all the authority to the combined Governor General. That is, the Governor General of Bengal was designated as Governor General of India. So all the powers would now rest in the Governor General's Council. Can Governor alone make laws? No. Governor General plus 4, GG plus 4 members in the Governor General's Council. Now, India as a British colony. India was declared as a British colony. Why? Because the complete control of the East India Company was completely done away with, was completely ended, right? It ended the earlier two exceptions also, right? What were the exceptions? Bengal and Bombay and Madras, those two exceptions were also deleted. Law Commission appointed to consolidate. When was the first Law Commission appointed by the Britishers? 1833. All right. I'm being a little fast. Why? Because these are revision classes and they have to be done in a time bound manner. The detailed classes, whenever I would come up with on Indian polity or other arenas, we will see the speed and the pace of proceeding would be very slow, right? At the end of this lecture, You would be given MCQs on the Telegram channel that you can use to your advantage. All the MCQs, be it of prelims or mains, previous year questions and practice ones will be shared on the Telegram channel in a short while after the lecture ends, right? So Telegram channel is Jatin Verma PW OnlyIAS, and the other dedicated channel UPSC Wala, that is there for English medium. Charter Act of 1833, importance of the act, centralization of administration reached new heights. We are seeing the significance. Centralization was one step ahead. Codification of laws was taken up for the first time. All the laws were consolidated, revenue laws, military, for example, commercial laws. Then it acknowledged the need to involve Indians in administration. So that is why open competition was sought to be promoted for the first time by the Act of 1833. Then, coming to another important act, Charter Act of 1854. It provided for the separation of executive and legislative functions of the council. Executive and legislative functions of the council will be separated. Which act we are talking about? 1853. It provided for the addition of 6 new members. 4 were there in the executive council. Okay, here we are talking about legislative council of the governor, Indian Central Legislative Council it will be called. Which act introduced the legislative council? 1853. How many members? 6 members, right? You can take a quick note of it. Civil services were thrown open to Indians, even though the Act of 1833 sought to promote open competition, but it was only in 1853 that open competition was promoted. Local representation in the Indian Central Legislative Council. Local representation in the Indian Central Legislative Council. Bombay, Agra, Madras, and Bengal. So, Indian Central Legislative Council will have local representation also in these 4 provinces. The Court of Directors could create a new presidency or province for the purpose of administrative convenience for better governance of India. Am I clear? New presidency or province. The act provided for the appointment of a separate governor for the Bengal presidency. The Governor General of India, who was until now acting as the Governor General of Bengal also, but since Bengal had become too big a province to be managed by one governor, that is why this separate governor for Bengal presidency was, the provision was created by the Act of 1853. Now let's have a look at their important details of Charter Act of 1853. Renewal of charter, indefinite period. No longer it will be restricted to 20 years or anything, because 1833 Act already ended the East India Company's role. Territorial possessions were legitimized. Okay. Now, law member will be there in the Executive Council, full membership. He will have full membership so as to advise the Governor General. Then, Court of Directors reduced to 18. Decreased powers. Court of Directors, if you remember, it was there to look after the commercial activities of East India Company. Now that East India Company is gone, it has been done away with. The power of the Court of Directors, majority of the powers were placed in the hands of the Governor General. They had limited powers, limited commercial powers. I repeat, Court of Directors, which was exercising the commercial powers on behalf of the company, will now have reduced power and their membership was reduced to 18. Competitive examination. Now patronage, that the anybody who is influential in Britain, his son or his relative would only become the civil servant in India in the covenanted position. No, now there will be merit based recruitment. Anybody who wishes to become a civil servant of the British rule, he has to go to London and appear in the examination, right? Separation of functions, additional members were placed and they were legislative purposes given to legislative powers given to them. 6 members addition, as I said, in the Legislative Council. Okay. New Legislative Council was created. Now, Charter Act of 1853, it established a separate Governor General's Legislative Council, which came to be known as Indian Legislative Council or Central Legislative Council. Right? It was also labeled as mini parliament. Mini parliament. Then introduced an open competition system for selection and recruitment of civil servants. The covenanted civil services was thus thrown open to the Indians also. It extended the company's rule and allowed to retain the possession of Indian territories on trust for British Crown. Right? This white text is not visible. I'll take care of it next time. So 1853 phase 1 is over now, right? Some of the important contributions of this act were, though it extended the authority of the East India Company, no time was provided for its rule, no indefinite time. So it kept the company on tenterhook. This meant that the rule of EIC could be terminated whenever British Parliament wanted to. Okay, it's not that the company would not be there. Please don't get confused when I say that East India Company is gone. No, company is created by the act of the parliament, so that company will always be there. Okay, but the control of the company over the political and administrative affairs of India was gone. Okay, so this is there now. The Macaulay Committee on Civil Services was appointed in 1854. Establishment of a dedicated rule-making body was also a step taken under Charter Act of 1853. So this company, British East India Company, I was telling you this point, it was always be on the tenter hooks. Whenever British Parliament would want, it can eliminate the rule of the or role of the company. No longer role of the company. So that company has to pay a huge sum to the British Parliament, to the British Exchequer, in order for the company to continue. Gradually, you see, in 1813, more merchants were allowed. 1833, company was done away with its military powers, etc. Court of Governors had seen reduction in their powers in 1833, 1853. Now, the company is at the beck and call, at the mercy of British Parliament. What is the British Parliament expected from the East India Company? That the company has to keep on declaring enough amount of profit to keep the British government in good humor, to keep the British government happy, right? Now starts the phase 2, the Crown Rule. After the revolt of 1857, government of Britain seized the opportunity to further consolidate its control in India. All the blames of misgovernance, extortion, bad practices were put on East India Company, and they seized the opportunity to take full control of the administration over here. So let's get to see the first act, the Crown Rule 1858. Sepoy Mutiny, the first revolt of independence, prompted the British Parliament to end the activities of East India Company. Henceforth, the powers of the Indian government, territories and revenue were transferred to the British Crown. British Crown. Queen Elizabeth. Okay. The acts passed during this time include this act was known as Act for the Good Government of India. See the name. Just to seize this opportunity, they are saying that Crown Rule will bring about good government of India. It will get rid of the bad rule by the East India Company. Did it happen? No. Okay. It ended the dual government scheme initiated due to Pitt's India. Court of Directors and Board of Directors. Board of Directors to look after the political and military affairs. Court of Directors of the company to look after commercial activities. So dual government was abolished by 1858. Okay, Secretary of State for India. Now, whenever these type of things happened, what did they do? They created this kind of a structure that now earlier they designated governor as Governor General. Governor General will have control over Bengal. Sitting in Bengal, Fort Williams, he will have control over Bombay and Madras. Okay. Now, above this Governor General, there will be Secretary of State for India, appointed by the British Parliament, appointed by the British government to look after India as a colony. India as a colony of Britishers. It will have advisory council to advise to the Secretary of State for governance of India. 15 members. Secretary of State would be a member of Parliament of Britain, belonging to British Parliament. Okay. Under him, there will be Governor General. The name of the Governor General was now changed to Viceroy. Right? Now, Act of 1858, we were here. The Secretary of State of India. The power of the company's court of directors were transferred to the Secretary of State for India. He was going to be the member of British Parliament. He was provided with the advisory body comprising of 15 members. Secretary of State in Council. Why Council? Because this advisory body of 15 members will be called as Council, Legislative Council. Okay, it was set up as a body corporate. Now, Secretary of State in Council was set up as a body corporate, like a company capable of suing in its capacity as an individual and being sued for its mischiefs. Okay, if anything wrong happens in India under a particular Secretary of State and his council, the members of the company, the members of the council, etc., will not be sued, but company as a body corporate, secretary's institution can be dragged to the court of law in Britain. Right? Now, salient provisions, the act abolished the company rule in India completely. Company rule was altogether abolished. It changed the designation of the Governor General of India by Viceroy. Abolished dual government. Now there will be no board of control and court of directors. There will be only advisory council. Secretary in state in council. Secretary of State designation came political head of India. Came to be known as, he became the political head of India in the real sense of the term. Now, designation changed. Lord Canning was the first Viceroy of India, direct representative of British Crown. Charles Wood was the first Secretary of State for India. Okay, Lord Canning was the first Viceroy. The nomenclature changed from Governor General to Viceroy. All right. Now, coming to the other aspects, a Viceroy would be appointed who would serve as the representative of the British Crown. Lord Canning was first such Viceroy, serving from 1858 to 1862. He was serving as a Governor General earlier. Now he was placed under the authority of a Secretary of State. India became a direct British colony through the passage of this act. The act ended the controversial doctrine of lapse. The doctrine of lapse was ended by this act. Now, Indian Civil Services was to be constituted for the Now, Indian Civil Service, the service connotation was missing. Okay, ICS was called as ICS only, even before the independence. Okay, it was Indian Police that was called Indian Police, but S was missing. Here, even though service was there, but this service was not the service to the people of India. It was the service to the Crown and its officials, British Crown. Indian Civil Service was to be constituted for better administration of India. Right? There was also a provision for Indians to be selected into the service through open competition, etc. Suzerainty. Indian provinces were allowed to retain their principalities, their territory, insofar as they accepted the suzerainty of the British. What does suzerainty mean? Suzerainty here means the surrender of power, that they owe their allegiance to the British Empire. If they accept the British suzerainty, they can continue their principalities. Done? This I have explained already. First Act. Now, Indian Councils Act of 1861. As the name tells you, Councils Act. It was an act of the Parliament of United Kingdoms that transformed India's Executive Council to function as cabinet, guys. It was now going to function as cabinet, run on the portfolio system. Now there will be ministerial portfolios, finance department, revenue, etc., law and order likewise. It was introduced because the British government wanted to involve the Indian people with the process of lawmaking. This act was passed on 1st August 1861. Date is not as important. Main provisions of the act: it made a beginning of representative institutions in India by associating Indians with the lawmaking. Until now, Indians were associated in the administration of the country through civil services open competition started from the Charter Act of 1833. Okay, Viceroy nominated some Indians. Were the Indians elected? No, Indians were to be nominated. Until the Morley Minto reforms of 1909, when the separate electorate thing was started, right? Until now, until then, what will happen? Nominated, Viceroy will nominate some of the members, some Indians as non-official members of his expanded council. Lord Canning nominated Raja of Banaras, the Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. It restored the legislative law-making powers of the Bombay and Madras, which were taken over by legislative powers of Bombay and Madras presidencies were taken over by which act? Please answer while watching it. Please answer it to yourself. I'm not deliberately telling it, right? Now, Indian Councils Act, you see here, ordinance making power. Let us first go through this. Establishment of new legislative councils for Bengal, Northwest Frontier Province and Punjab. Northwest Frontier Province, Bengal and Punjab. New legislative councils. Viceroy could make provisions for convenient transactions of business in the council. Convenient transaction of business in the council. Okay, Viceroy can make rules. This is to present day Indian constitution. There is an article that president or the government of India can make rules for convenient transaction. Article 77 of the present day constitution has been borrowed from Indian Councils Act of 1861. Okay, portfolio system, it gave recognition to the portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning, the first Viceroy of India after the change in the nomenclature. Ordinances could be issued by Viceroy without the concurrence of the Council during an emergency only. However, these ordinances will survive only for 6 months. After that, they have to be reintroduced or they have to be approved by the British Parliament. Within the 6 months, they have to be approved. Viceroy can introduce ordinances only during emergency. Okay. Now, see, ordinance provision is there. This ordinance provision is taken care of. We have seen this. Restored the legislative powers of Bombay and Madras Presidency. Indian Councils Act of 1861. Repetition here. It restored the powers of Bombay and Madras Presidencies. Legislation. Now here the legislative powers were restored back. We've seen this point, right? Lawmaking, beginning of representative institutions. Now, Lord Canning nominated Raja Banaras. These things restored legislative powers of Bombay and Madras. So, this provision is taken care of. Now, fifth member, gentleman of legal profession, was added to the council. Portfolio system, wherein ministerial berths would be allocated, was introduced by this Act of 1861. Right? Now, the Act of 1861, the drawbacks. The biggest drawback of this act was regarding the selection and the role of additional members. What will be the selection criteria of Indians? Is it be mere sycophancy or mere loyalty to the British Parliament, British rule, or it will be something concrete like their knowledge, their qualification, etc. Okay, and what will be their role? Would they be just sitting as decorations or would they be actually contributing? Would their advice be considered or not? These members did not take part in the discussions and their role was only advisory. The non-official, as the name tells you, they are non-official in nature, right? The non-official members of the Executive Council were not interested in attending the meetings of the council because they were non-official in their capacity. So there is no point in them attending the meeting. Under this act, they were not bound to attend. They were not bound to attend. Raja of Banaras, etc., they were least interested. Okay, they were merely happy with the title. The Indian members were not eligible to oppose any bill, and most often the bills were passed in one sitting without any let alone effective discussion. Without any discussion, even for namesake, they were not associated with it. Even though provisions were brought about, but they were dead in letter. They were dead in spirit. They were dead letters of law. Provision for discussion, etc., non-official members, that was of no use. Am I clear? Now, These provisions being there, coming to Indian Councils Act of 1892. Indian Councils Act 1892, it was an act of British Parliament that introduced various amendments to the composition and functions of legislative councils. As I told you that there were certain drawbacks of Act of 1861 which were sought to be rectified by 1892. Now remember guys, this topic itself is very, very monotonous in nature. You all know about it, right? Very, very factual in nature. I'm trying my best to help you guys understand the nuances, but this is the harsh truth about it, that these details need to be mugged up. When it comes to constitution, preamble, parliament, we will be seeing the details in the coming sessions on Indian polity and governance, which I'll be taking. These first 2-3 chapters, I would say the very first chapter is very, very boring in nature. Nonetheless, every second or third year, we are seeing some questions appearing from it. Now, the main provisions of the Act: members could now debate the budget without having the ability to vote on it. No right to vote on the budget. So, first line here, most notably, the Act expanded the number of members in the central and provincial councils. Composition and functions of the legislative councils were refined, and composition of the members in the central and provincial councils was expanded. Number of members. Members could now debate the budget without having the ability to vote on it, like we see in the Rajya Sabha. We are talking about Indian Councils Act of 1892. The Governor General in Council, set up by the Act of 1853, was given the authority to set rules for members' nomination. In 1861 Act, we saw that selection and the role of additional members, the selection criteria was ambiguous. So that is why the Governor General in Council now will have the power to make rules for the nomination, subject to the approval of Secretary of State for India. So Secretary of State, Governor General, okay, he will have the nomination rules. He will make the nomination rules for selection of nominated members, which will ultimately have to be approved by Secretary of State. Okay. Made a limited and indirect provision for the use of elections in filling up non-official seats, both in central and provincial councils. So, number of members was increased, selection criteria to be prescribed by Governor General, to be ultimately approved by Secretary of State. Now, element of elections in the nominated members, in the non-official members rather, was introduced for the first time by the Act of 1892. Be clear about it. Nomination for non-official members to Central Legislative Council, Bengal Chamber of Commerce, governors for provincial legislative councils based on the recommendations of district boards. So, nomination for non-official members to Central Legislative Councils, be it Bengal Chambers of Commerce, governors, will be made based on the recommendations of district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, zamindars. So, Britishers were in a way trying to refine this nomination criteria after the criticism faced by them for 1861. Only the Britishers, the people loyal to them, for example, Raja of Banaras, Punjab, the ones who were sycophants, the ones who were very, very loyal to the British Raj, were only appointed, and they were not required to attend the meetings. That is why these drawbacks of Act of 1861 were sought to be rectified by the Act of 1892. Am I clear? Now, main provisions of the Act: increase the non-official members in the council. Bombay would now have 8 members, Madras 20, Bengal 20, Northwest Frontier Province 15, Awadh in a way 15. Central Legislative Council minimum 10, maximum 16 members. Central Legislative Council for India. Okay. Now, significance, the contribution of the Act. It is a significant milestone in the Indian constitutional evolutionary history. The Act increased the size of various legislative councils in India, thereby increasing the engagement of Indians. The increase in the size led to, inadvertently, it led to increased association of Indians, right? Now, the act created the stage for development of revolutionary forces in India because the British only made a minor concession. Britishers only made a minor concession. Even though Indians were expecting that after the revolt of 1857, something will happen in 1861. Happened, but there were some flaws, drawbacks in the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Then again, the expectations of Indians were belied by the Act of 1892. All the expectations were not met. So that is why this Act of 1892 is said to have sown the seeds of next phase of revolution in the India's struggle for independence. Now we will see partition of Bengal as a step in 1905 by the Britishers to divide the unity being witnessed after the failure of 1892 Act to appease Indians, to pacify the angry revolutionaries. That is why we saw Surat split. Extremists were not happy with the way moderates were putting pressure on Britishers. Likes of Bhagat Singh, they wanted to exert more pressure. Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Okay, so that is why we saw Surat split. And after Surat split, we see Morley Minto reforms, a further step to divide the unity among Indians, this time between Hindus and Muslims. Partition of Bengal, 1905, 16th of October 1905, was brought about so as to divide the unison, divide the unity among the Indians. Surya Hussain and others, people who were associated in India's freedom struggle from Bengal, so that they could be divided into two parts. Clear? Now, Government of India Act of 1909, also known as Morley-Minto Reforms, Lord Morley was the then Secretary of State for India and Lord Minto was the then Viceroy. Morley-Minto Reforms, it considerably increased the size of Legislative Council both at the central and provincial level. Let me just take a glass of water. Pardon me for this. Okay, so you see here, it enlarged the deliberative functions. Now, earlier in the 1861, after the passage of 1861 Act, we were saying that the members were not having effective discussion, let alone effective. Discussions were not even happening as the non-official members were not required. They were not even required to bring about the law. I'm not well today, having fever, but since we had announced the launch of this initiative from today onwards, so I'm recording this lecture. That is my effectiveness may not be as good. Pardon me for that today. Now, it introduced official majority. Non-official majority, that means majority of the elected members of the council will be there. They will be elected members will be in majority at the provincial legislature level. Tell me, is it a good step for the Indians? Yes. Elected members would be more in number. Okay, it enlarged the deliberative functions of the legislative council at both the levels. Okay, both the levels, central and provincial level. It provided for the first time for Indians to be associated with the executive council, legislative council plus the executive council. In the legislative council, Indians were sought to be associated from the Act of 1861, though it was not implemented in the right spirit. Now the Association of Indians is taking place in the Executive Council. SP Sinha sir became the first law member in the Viceroy's Executive Council to advise the Viceroy of the legal matters about the governance of India. Done? Now, coming to the other aspect, aim. 1909 Act had the aim to appease moderates. Because of the 1905 Bengal partition, two sects or two segments were created, extremists and moderates. Okay, now moderates were being fooled by the British government. To assuage, to pacify the moderates, 1909 Act was introduced so that moderates also do not switch side towards extremists. Okay, I ask you a question from history. I ask you a question from history here, just forgetting that question. Was Gokhale an extremist or a moderate? If I remember the name correctly, just answer. Okay. Tilak festivals, yeah. Was Tilak an extremist or moderate? Just answer this. Okay. Now, Lord S.P. Sinha taken in the Executive Council of Viceroy as a member of law. Introduced the separate electorate for Muslims. Now, divide and rule being practiced by the Britishers. British policy of divide and rule. Moderates welcomed the reforms but were against the separate electorates based on religion. First, 1905 territorial division of India, now the religious division of Indians through Molle Minto reforms of 1909. Now, salient provisions, it laid the foundations for many features that we associate with in the Indian constitution in the present times. Government of India Act 1919. Okay, so some of the features of Government of India Act 1919 and then many features of Government of India Act 1935. Our Indian constitution has borrowed ditto from these two acts. Okay, Government of India Act of 1919 was thus enacted, which came into force in 1921. Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, as they are called, objective gradual introduction of responsible government. That the government so created would be responsible one. How would we ensure the responsible government? We would be able to have a responsible government only if it is elected for the people, by the people, and it is of the people, of Indians, right? So gradually we will see this should have happened at a faster pace, but it did not until the Indian Independence Act of 1947. It relaxed the control of center over the provinces by demarcating and separating central and provincial subjects. So two lists were created. Okay, two lists were created. Diarchy, provincial subjects were divided into transferred list and reserved list. Provincial subjects were divided into transferred list and reserved list. Reserved list subjects will be kept by the governor, will be kept by the Secretary of State, and transferred subjects would be left to the Indians, to the councils. Reserved lists were administered by the governor and his executive council that were not answerable to the legislature. Non-answerability to legislature even after the Act of 1919. Bear this in mind. Whereas transferred lists were administered by the governor on the advice of the ministers responsible to the legislative council. Done? Bicameralism. Two houses, direct elections were introduced for the first time. Government of India Act of 1919. The act mandated that the three of the six members of the Viceroy's executive councils were to be Indian. Three members would now be Indians. 3 out of 6, 50-50. Okay, principle of separate electorates was extended to, not now, they are not confining themselves to Muslims. Britishers are extending the separate electorate policy to Sikhs, Indian Christians, and Anglo-Indians, thereby, and Europeans also, thereby further deepening the divide and rule tactics. It granted franchise to a limited number of people on the basis of property. People who are having property, who are paying tax, and on the basis of their educational qualification. Right? High Commissioner of India's position was created. Some powers of Secretary of State were transferred to the High Commissioner of India. Just a division, artificial division, so that the entire blame is not put on to the secretary, just to legitimize the change. Okay, legitimize the, again, the divisive tactics. Now, provincial budgets was separated for the first time from the central budget. States, the provinces will have their own budget. Do we have this today? Yes. That is why Government of India Act 1919 copied, certain sections of it have been copied in the Constitution of Independent India. Central Public Service Commission was created by the present day UPSC kind of a thing, but it was central. Okay, statutory commission was set up to analyze the impact of this act after 10 years. So this act was passed in 1919, 1929 or 1928. Now, Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, in a snapshot. You can quickly go through it while revising things. I've tried to incorporate as many flowcharts and small mind maps wherever relevant, wherever it was possible. Now, Simon Commission was appointed. Major recommendations of Simon Commission: abolition of diarchy. This report of Simon Commission led to or fed into the enactment of or the drafting of the Ultimate Act, Government of India Act 1935. Okay. So, abolition of diarchy, extension of responsible government in provinces, extension of responsible government not only in the center, that was done by 1919 Act, continuation of communal representation. Despite the resistance, despite various things happening, first round table, etc., continuation of communal representation was an essential part after 1909, thereby leading to partition of India through the Indian Independence Act. Okay, that was just a culmination. That was obviously supposed to happen. Establishment of a federation of British India and princely states. Now, communal award in August 1932, Ramsay MacDonald, the then British Prime Minister, introduced divisory tactics for oppressed classes also, for the minorities also, which came to be known as communal award. The award not only continued separate electorates for Muslims, Sikhs, Indian Christians, Europeans, Anglo-Indians and Europeans, but also extended it to the depressed classes. Okay, SCs, STs. Gandhiji was highly distressed with this, and ultimately it led to a kind of samjhauta, a kind of agreement between the freedom fighters and the depressed classes, and it is known as Pune Pact. Right? The agreement was between Gandhiji and the leaders of the depressed classes that they would reject it. Okay, so communal award 1932 was sought to be rejected. Ultimately, 1935 Act. After that, we'll see 1947. That was mere declaration of independence. Okay, but 1935 Act becomes important. The Act marked the second milestone towards a completely responsible government. It provided for establishment of an all India federation consisting of provinces and princely states as units. Provinces was that part of India which was in the control of Britishers. Okay. It divided the powers between the center and units in terms of three lists: federal list, provincial list, and concurrent list. In terms of three lists: federal list, provincial list, and concurrent list. Do we see it this day? Yes. Union list, state list, concurrent list. Schedule 7 of the Indian Constitution. Residuary powers were given to the Viceroy. Okay. However, this federation never fructified since princely states did not join it. See, is very easy question can be made out of this. Did princely states join it or not? Done. It abolished diarchy in provinces and introduced a provincial autonomy in its place. Abolished diarchy in provinces and introduced provincial autonomy. Diarchy means transferred subjects and reserved subjects. That kind of a division of subjects was done away with, and provincial autonomy. That means autonomy will be given to the states for the subjects that are kept in the state list. Provincial subjects. The Act introduced responsible government in provinces. That is, the governor was required to act with the advice of ministers. So, governor, even though would be appointed by the Britishers, would have to act on the aid and advice of the ministers. There are no reserved subjects here. Okay, reserved subjects can be said to be residuary subjects or subjects kept by the federal subjects kept in the federal list. Got it? Now, it provided for the adoption of diarchy at the center. Diarchy at the center, division of the subjects at the center in the form of transferred subjects and reserved subjects was retained. However, this provision did not come into effect at all. Bicameralism was introduced in 6 provinces: Bengal, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam, and the United Provinces. Okay, in these 6 provinces, bicameralism, yani ki that means 2 houses were there. Separate electorates were further extended to depressed classes. Separate electorate, that is Communal Award 1932, was rendered ineffective by Government of India Act of 1935. Done. Council of India Act, which was established as per the 18 Council of India, which was established as per the Act of 1858, was abolished. The Secretary of State was instead provided with a team of advisors. Secretary of State will be provided with the team of advisors, no longer SOS in Council. Done. Council of India was abolished. Secretary will just be having advisors. The Act provided for setting up of Federal Public Service Commission. Today, as we call it as Union Public Service Commission. Okay. Government of India Act 1919 set up Central Public Service Commission. Okay. Provincial Public Service Commission, Joint Public Service Commission, Federal Court, Reserve Bank of India, etc. Okay. So this is there. Now, how the Government of India Act 1935 divided powers. This act divided powers between the center and the provinces. Three lists that were there, we have seen it already. Now, features: provincial autonomy, diarchy, bicameral legislature, federal court, then franchise, right to vote, reorganization of states, then bicameral legislature, right? So these were the essential features. Now, finally, coming to the last leg of our lecture today, Indian Independence Act 1947. Salient features of Indian Independence Act are: it declared India as an independent and sovereign state. What do we mean by sovereign? That means India can decide its own policy. It provided for the partition of India and creation of two new dominions, partition, India and Pakistan. It abolished the position of Secretary of State for India. Finally, British government is letting go of the control. It abolished the office of Viceroy and provided for each dominion a Governor General who was to be appointed by the British King on the advice of the Dominion Cabinet. Appointment again by the British King. Governor General will still be there. It empowered the constituent assemblies of the two dominions to frame and adopt any constitution for their respective nations. So why this last leg of appointment of Governor General was there? So as to supervise the transition of power until the constitution is drafted and to repeal any act of British Parliament, including the Independence Act of 1947 itself. Okay. Salient features of this act: the constituent assemblies were empowered to legislate for their respective dominions. Whatever laws will be, regulations will be made by the Constituent Assembly of India from the period this Independence Act of 1947, sorry, okay, 1947, till the drafting of the new constitution, ultimate enactment of the new constitution comes into force. All those laws, bylaws, rules made by the Constituent Assembly to manage the dominion of India will be held to be valid. Governance of each dominion was to be conducted based on the provisions of Government of India Act of 1935. British monarch could no longer ask for bills or veto them. They can no longer stop the bills to be passed. Okay. However, this was reserved for the Governor General. Governor General of the dominions were made to act on the aid and advice of the council. Governor General will be there as a caretaker, you can say. Done. Evaluation: it was a hastened act passed in a rush because of lack of time. That is why there is lack of clarity, okay, on the border. Still, it has repercussions today with constant tussle between India and Pakistan and China. Now, Jammu and Kashmir question was not decided. Britishers wanted to leave India ASAP, as soon as possible, so that the blame of what is going to happen after this act, bloodshed, partition, should not be put on them. Okay. Rise in communal feeling. Another unforeseen, rather, they had planted the seeds of communal violence very, very carefully. The division of Indians. Okay. So that ultimately happened. Suspicion: Indian Muslims were frequently suspected of harboring loyalties towards Pakistan. Non-Muslim minorities in Pakistan are increasingly vulnerable thanks to the so-called Islamization of life. This is the criticism. This was all. MCQs, PYQs will be shared, as I said, through the Word document. Okay, you can attempt them to check your knowledge, but before you do that, just revise the things through this PPT. Everything that has been mentioned on the broadest lines possible. Okay, narrow details, micro details, wherever relevant, I have incorporated them because UPSC is more interested in knowing your broader knowledge. It is not going into the nitty gritty. Nitty gritty in Indian polity is not being asked. That will be the job of our history teacher. Okay, and he will be taking due care of that. Who was appointed, names, years, etc. We are here, insofar as historical context of Indian constitution is concerned, we are more concerned about the administrative and political structure that we have attended to. So this was all. Next lecture will be uploaded tomorrow at around 6 p.m. Okay. Every day the lectures will be uploaded at around 6 p.m. PDF you can download from the Telegram channel Jatin Verma PW Only IAS and the UPSC Wala PW UPSC Wala Telegram channel also. Now this is the QR code for the Telegram channel. If you want, you can download the same. See you again tomorrow, guys. It was a pleasure taking you through the static portion from where around one or two questions appear as a mix of politico, legal, political and history questions. So be prepared with this. These topics are low hanging fruits, I would say. Thank you. Bye bye. See you tomorrow, guys. Have a nice time.